What happens when America's sharpest late-night host comes face-to-face with royalty's most controversial figure? What happens when years of carefully crafted public personas collide in the most unexpected way possible? Tonight, we witnessed something that nobody saw coming. A moment so raw and unfiltered that it left millions of viewers speechless, and one of the most composed public figures in the world reduced to tears on national television. This is the story of how a routine late-night interview turned into television history. How Stephen Colbert's relentless questioning style met its match, and how Meghan Markle's carefully constructed narrative finally cracked under pressure. Before we dive into this incredible confrontation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds. This is unlike anything you've ever seen on late-night television. The studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy as Stephen Colbert prepared for what seemed like just another celebrity interview. The Late Show had hosted countless A-listers, politicians, and public figures. But tonight's guest carried a different kind of weight. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, sat across from Colbert in the iconic interview chair. Her posture perfect, her smile practiced every inch the polished public figure who had navigated royal protocols and media storms with apparent grace. The audience applauded warmly as Colbert introduced her with his trademark wit. And for the first few minutes everything proceeded exactly as expected. "So Meghan," Colbert began, leaning back in his chair with that familiar mischievous glint in his eye. "You've had quite the journey from suits to royalty to, well, whatever this current chapter is. How would you describe where you are right now in your life?" His tone was light, conversational, the kind of softball opening that guests usually appreciate. Meghan's response was equally polished, a carefully rehearsed answer about finding her authentic voice and using her platform for positive change. She spoke about her various projects, her podcast, her children's book, hitting all the expected talking points with the precision of someone who had given this same answer dozens of times before. But Stephen Colbert hadn't built his reputation on accepting surface-level answers. As Meghan finished her response, something shifted in his demeanor. The smile remained, but his eyes sharpened. And when he leaned forward, the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. "That's interesting," he said, his voice taking on a different quality. "Because I've been watching your interviews over the past few years, and I notice you always talk about finding your authentic voice. But here's what I'm curious about, Meghan. Which voice is the authentic one? The one that praised the royal family during your engagement interview? The one that detailed systemic racism and mental health struggles with Oprah, or the one sitting here with me tonight?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Meghan's smile faltered for just a microsecond before snapping back into place, but that brief moment was enough. The audience, sensing the shift in energy, grew quieter. "Well, Stephen," she replied, her voice maintaining its measured tone. "I think people evolve, and my experiences have shaped my perspective. When you're in an institution like the royal family, you learn things that you couldn't have known from the outside." She was trying to redirect to give another practiced response. But Colbert wasn't having it. "Sure, people evolve," he nodded. "But we're not talking about evolution here, are we? We're talking about completely contradictory statements. You told the world that Kate made you cry over flower girl dresses, but then later said it was actually the other way around. You said you had no idea what royal life would be like, but court documents later revealed you'd researched Harry extensively. So, I'm asking again, which version should we believe?" His voice wasn't angry. It was worse than that. It was clinically precise, the tone of someone who had done his homework and wasn't going to let carefully crafted talking points slide by unchallenged. Meghan's composure began to crack in earnest now. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, began to fidget. "I think you're oversimplifying very complex situations," she said. But her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. When you're dealing with an institution that has 1,000 years of history, things aren't black and white. There are protocols, there are expectations, and sometimes you have to navigate very carefully. She was deflecting again, but Colbert had clearly decided that tonight deflection wasn't going to work. "Meghan," he said, and now his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter. "I've interviewed presidents, war criminals, and some of the most controversial figures of our time. They all have one thing in common. They eventually get called out when their stories don't add up. So, let me be very direct here. You've built an entire brand around being the victim of an uncaring institution. But a lot of people are starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, you're not quite the innocent party you've portrayed yourself to be. The words hit Meghan like a physical blow. For a moment, she sat completely still, her face a mask of controlled shock. The studio audience, which had been murmuring quietly, fell into complete silence. You could hear the cameras warring, capturing every micro-expression as one of the world's most media-savvy figures struggled to formulate a response to the most direct challenge she had faced in years of interviews. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice tight with barely contained emotion. "But I think you're being incredibly unfair. You're taking complex situations and trying to reduce them to sound bites. That's not how real life works, Stephen." But even as she spoke, her usual composure was unraveling. Her hands were now visibly shaking, and there was a tremor in her voice that hadn't been there moments before. Colbert leaned back slightly, but his expression remained unchanged. "Unfair, Meghan. You've made millions of dollars telling your story. You've sat in front of cameras and accused people of racism, of driving you to thoughts of self-harm, of institutional cruelty. These aren't small claims. These are life-altering accusations that have damaged reputations and relationships. So when I ask you to clarify contradictions in your own statements, that's not unfair. That's journalism." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. Meghan's breathing became more shallow, more visible. "You don't understand what it was like," she said, and now her voice was rising slightly, losing that carefully modulated tone that had carried her through countless interviews. "You don't understand the pressure, the isolation, the way they make you feel like you're going crazy. Everything I said was true. Everything." "Which everything?" Colbert pressed. And his relentless pursuit was like watching a master craftsman at work. "The everything where you told Oprah you were naive about royal life? Or the everything in the court documents that showed you'd studied Diana's life extensively? The everything where you said the institution refused to help with your mental health, or the everything where royal sources provided evidence of multiple resources being offered? I'm trying to understand, Meghan, but you're giving me multiple versions of the truth here." Something inside Meghan seemed to snap. Her carefully maintained facade cracked wide open. And for the first time in the interview, viewers saw something raw and unfiltered. "Stop," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Just stop. You're twisting everything. You're making me out to be some kind of liar, some kind of manipulator, and that's not who I am. I'm a human being. I'm a mother. I've been through things that you could never understand." But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, her emotional response seemed to fuel his determination to get to the truth. "I'm not twisting anything, Meghan. I'm quoting your own words. Back to you, your own documented statements. And you're right. You are a human being, which is exactly why people deserve honesty from you, not carefully constructed narratives that change depending on the audience." Tears were forming in Meghan's eyes now, though she was fighting desperately to maintain control. The cameras captured every moment as one of the most controlled public figures of the modern era began to crumble under the weight of sustained questioning. "You want honesty," she said, her voice now openly shaking. "Fine. Maybe I did know more about royal life than I let on. Maybe I did research Harry's family, his history, his mother's story. Maybe I wasn't as naive as I claimed to be. But that doesn't mean everything else was a lie." The admission sent shock waves through the studio. This was the first time Meghan had publicly acknowledged any inconsistency in her narrative, and Colbert seized on it immediately. "So, you lied about being naive," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "What else did you embellish? Because once we establish that parts of your story were fabricated, it becomes very difficult to know what to believe." Meghan's composure was completely gone now. The tears she had been fighting were flowing freely, and her voice was thick with emotion. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she sobbed. "I just wanted to protect myself, to protect my family. When you're being attacked from all sides, when the press is destroying you every single day, you do whatever you have to do to survive. You tell the story that will make people understand. Even if it's not exactly how things happened." The confession was devastating. Here was Meghan Markle on live television admitting that she had manipulated her own narrative for public sympathy. The studio audience was completely silent, transfixed by the dramatic unraveling happening before their eyes. Colbert, sensing that he had reached a crucial moment, pressed forward with surgical precision. So, when you told the world that Kate made you cry, when you detailed conversations about your son's skin color, when you described being refused help for your mental health struggles, some of those details were altered to create a more sympathetic narrative. His voice was steady, professional, but the impact of his words was explosive. Meghan was openly weeping now, her hands covering her face as years of carefully constructed public relations work collapsed in real time. "I don't know," she whispered through her tears. "I don't know anymore what was real and what was just trying to survive." The devastation in Meghan's voice hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. The admission that she could no longer distinguish between reality and the narrative she had crafted for survival was perhaps the most human moment she had ever displayed publicly. But Stephen Colbert, recognizing the weight of this moment, didn't pause to let her recover. This was television history unfolding and he knew it. "Meghan," he said, his voice softer now, but no less penetrating. "Millions of people around the world have defended you, have fought for you, have seen you as a symbol of standing up against institutional racism and oppression. They've attacked Harry's family. They've taken sides in a very public and painful family drama, all based on the story you told. Don't you think they deserve to know the truth?" The question seemed to break something fundamental inside her. Meghan looked up from her hands, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her composure completely shattered. "The truth," she repeated, her voice hollow and defeated. "The truth is that I was scared. The truth is that I thought if I could just make people understand how hard it was, how isolated I felt, maybe they would protect me. Maybe they would choose me over an institution that felt cold and unwelcoming." She paused, struggling to catch her breath between sobs. "But it spiraled so far beyond what I ever intended. Every interview, every story, it had to be bigger, more dramatic, more compelling than the last one. Because if people stopped caring about my pain, what would I have left?" Colbert leaned forward, his expression now showing a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine concern. "So, the racism allegations, the claims about your son's skin color, the suicidal thoughts, were any of those real, or were they all part of this survival narrative?" The question hit like a thunderbolt. Meghan's crying intensified, and for a long moment, she couldn't speak at all. The cameras captured every second of her internal struggle. The battle between continuing the facade and finally telling the complete truth. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. "There were conversations," she said, each word seeming to cost her enormous effort. "But they weren't what I made them sound like. They were concerned questions from family members who were trying to understand what their future grandchild might face in the public eye. They weren't malicious. They weren't racist. They were just people trying to navigate an unprecedented situation." The admission was earth-shattering. Here was Meghan Markle on live television, essentially recanting one of the most explosive claims of her Oprah interview. The studio audience was absolutely silent, watching history unfold in real time, and the mental health crisis. Colbert pressed, his journalistic instincts driving him forward, even as the human tragedy played out before him. Meghan's voice cracked completely. "I was struggling. I was overwhelmed and unhappy and feeling trapped. But when I asked for help, they did try to help me. They offered resources. They offered support. But I was so angry, so determined to prove that they were the villains in my story, that I rejected everything they offered. I told the world they refused to help me because it made for a better narrative." The confession was complete and devastating. Years of carefully constructed victimhood, of international sympathy, of public relations warfare, all crumbling in real time on live television. Colbert, recognizing the magnitude of what was happening, pressed for one final truth. "Meghan, why are you telling me this now? Why are you destroying everything you've built with these admissions?" She looked directly into the camera, tears streaming down her face, her voice raw with emotion. "Because I can't live with it anymore. Because Harry doesn't deserve what I've put him through. Because his family doesn't deserve what I've put them through. Because every day I wake up knowing that millions of people hate his father, his brother, his sister-in-law, based on lies I told to protect my own image." She took a shuddering breath before continuing. "I thought I could control the narrative forever. But you can't live in a lie indefinitely. It eats away at everything, including the people you love most. Harry married someone he thought was brave enough to stand up to an institution. But really, he married someone who was just scared and willing to say anything to avoid being disliked. The raw honesty was breathtaking and heartbreaking simultaneously. Colbert, for perhaps the first time in the interview, seemed at a loss for words. The moment stretched on, filled only with the sound of Meghan's quiet crying and the barely audible hum of television equipment. Finally, Colbert spoke. "What happens now, Meghan? How do you move forward from this?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, somehow finding a small reserve of strength. "I don't know. I honestly don't know. I've destroyed so much with my need to be seen as the victim. I've hurt people I care about. I've misled people who trusted me. And I've turned a family drama into an international incident. I guess I have to figure out how to live with the truth now, even if it's uglier than the story I told." Colbert, sensing that this moment needed to be fully explored, leaned forward one more time. "Meghan, you mentioned Harry. How do you think he's going to react to what you've just revealed? He's defended you publicly. He's burned bridges with his own family for you. What do you say to him now?" The question seemed to pierce through whatever composure Meghan had managed to rebuild. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she contemplated the magnitude of what she had just done to her marriage, her family, her entire life. "Harry," she whispered, speaking as if he were there in the room with her. "I'm so sorry. I dragged you into this web of lies because I was too proud to admit I was struggling. I made you choose between me and your family based on things that weren't entirely true." She paused, her voice growing stronger with each word, as if the act of confession was somehow liberating her. "You fell in love with someone you thought was brave. But I was just broken. And instead of getting help, instead of being honest about my struggles, I created this elaborate narrative where everyone else was the villain and I was the victim. I turned your grief about your mother into a weapon against your family. I used your loyalty against you." The raw emotion in her voice was devastating to witness. Colbert, recognizing the historical significance of what was unfolding, asked one final crucial question. "Do you think Harry knew on some level? Do you think he suspected that the story wasn't entirely accurate?" Meghan's response was immediate and heartbreaking. "I think Harry wanted to believe me so badly that he ignored his own instincts. I think there were moments when he questioned things, when he noticed inconsistencies, but he chose to believe me because he loved me. And that makes what I've done to him even worse. I took advantage of his love, his loyalty, his trauma about losing his mother, and I used all of it to justify my lies." She looked directly into the camera again, her makeup completely ruined, her carefully styled hair disheveled, looking more human and vulnerable than she had ever appeared in public. "To everyone who defended me, who argued with friends and family about my story, who saw me as some kind of symbol of resistance against institutional oppression, I'm sorry. You deserved better from me. You deserved the truth." The silence that followed was profound. Colbert, for one of the rare times in his career, seemed genuinely moved by what he was witnessing. "Meghan," he said quietly, "this has been one of the most extraordinary interviews I've ever conducted. I came here tonight prepared to challenge your narrative, but I never expected this level of honesty. What you've done tonight took incredible courage." Meghan managed a weak smile through her tears. "Or incredible stupidity. I've just destroyed everything I've built over the past few years. But maybe that's what needed to happen. Maybe I needed to stop being the Duchess of Sussex, stop being the victim, stop being the brand and just be Meghan again. Even if Meghan turns out to be more flawed and complicated than the story I told the world." The interview was clearly over, but the impact was just beginning. Meghan sat back in her chair, emotionally and physically drained, while Colbert processed what had just transpired. Television history had been made. A carefully constructed public persona had been completely dismantled. And millions of viewers had witnessed one of the most dramatic confessions in recent memory. As the cameras continued to roll, capturing the aftermath of this extraordinary confrontation, one thing was abundantly clear. Nothing would ever be the same for Meghan Markle, the royal family, or the millions of people who had chosen sides in a story that turned out to be far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The ramifications of this confession would ripple through royal circles, media landscapes, and public opinion for years to come. What did you think of this incredible confrontation? Have you ever seen anything like this on live television before? Do you think Meghan's confession was genuine or just another calculated move? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more explosive celebrity interviews and shocking revelations.